We ready? Okay, I think we will get started. So good afternoon, and thank you for coming back promptly, those that are here. So our next session, well, first, I'm Cindy Studebaker. I am with the Corps of Engineers Portland District, and I oversee the AFEP Estuary studies, and I'll be convening or moderating this session this afternoon. So as your moderator, there are two things that I hope you will get by the end of this session. One is a better understanding of the Columbia Estuary Ecosystem Restoration Program, and and some of the specific adjustments that we're making to that, which Mike Turaski will talk about. And then the second is that you will have a better understanding, or perhaps just better insight, into some of the emerging science that is coming out of some of the research that's happening in the estuary, which is not, what you'll hear this afternoon is not the entirety of the estuary RMNE program. It's more about two slices of a pie. But hopefully you will have just better insight into some of that sort of the emerging science. So with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Mike Turaski. He is the Estuary Program Manager for the Corps of Engineers Portland District. And he will be talking today about the nexus between regional sediment management, engineering with nature, and beneficial use of dredged material.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be here. I tried to come up with the longest title possible for this talk. Maybe I succeeded, I don't know. But the key thing here is that what I'd like to present today is really a look into what is very much a work in progress with Portland District, with our estuary program in general, with some of the sponsors and resource agencies that we work with. We're starting to explore this topic of how we could be using sand dredged from the navigation channel to help meet some of our habitat restoration objectives. So I want to give you a little flavor for what we're thinking about, why we're thinking about it, and how we're going about answering some of the questions that we've identified so far. I'll start with an overview of the Cert program, Columbia Estuary Ecosystem Restoration Program. This refers to the work that the Corps and Bonneville Power do in the estuary. You can see on the slide here, it's not just about restoring ecosystems, it's also understanding them. We do a lot of work with a range of sponsors and other external scientists from Pacific Northwest National Lab and NOAA Fisheries and others. We really do implement this adaptive management model of restoring, monitoring, learning, thinking about what that means and making adjustments going forward. We utilize the expert regional technical group for insight and evaluation of proposed projects, and they've certainly given us some feedback on the ideas that I'll be presenting today. And as things now stand, we accomplish restoration primarily through hydrologic reconnection of tidal and freshwater wetlands. By that I mean breaching levees, removing culverts, removing old tide gates, things of that nature. And I'm here today speaking about this topic of beneficial use because we're at a point where we're starting to realize some of the constraints inherent in this primary strategy. Opportunities for floodplain reconnection are not unlimited in the estuary. And by the same token, we have a lot of sand that we dredge that we're not specifically targeting for restoration purposes, and we think we might be able to do better with that. Here's a snapshot of where we stand now in terms of, from a Corps of Engineers perspective, a very simplified view of the estuary. We have our habitat restoration program, which I just described. And then we have a routine program of maintaining the federal navigation channel, the 105 miles or so between Portland and the mouth, primarily, but also above Portland up to Bonneville Dam. We occasionally dredge up there. We annually dredge around, 5 million cubic yards of clean sediment. Around 70% of that is placed back in the water, but not necessarily for purposes of habitat benefits. A portion of the remainder is placed in upland locations, and then another portion is placed along shorelines. So we have a very active, large program of navigation maintenance. And I would say that as things now stand, these truly are separate programs. We each accomplish our mission. We have some understanding of what the other is doing, but we're not actively looking to integrate the two. And that's partly what Cindy and I are trying to tackle going forward, is how could we be better integrating these programs. In the broad sense, you can see on the screen what our hypothesis is. Put simply, can we use dredge material to emulate natural processes in the estuary and restore habitat? We think this is possible, partly just the fundamentals of the estuary we see today. That habitat that we're trying to restore, or that we're trying to protect and conserve, was formed as a result of physical processes that moved sediment and deposited it and reshaped it, and eventually allowed for vegetation to establish. So that's one reason. And the second reason is because we've observed that a lot of good habitat in the estuary was actually formed on dredge material, or in ways that are closely related to how we manage the navigation channel. Some people call that accidental habitat creation. And so that gives us some idea that, well, if we could do it as an unintentional byproduct, perhaps we could do it as an intentional approach. Finally, I'm not suggesting that all dredge material placement is going to benefit fish and wildlife. There will be conflicts and there will be impacts, but we think with this hypothesis that we could get some benefits or more benefits. Before I go further, I'd like to just outline a couple of key terms that you'll hear me use, partly so you understand that what we're trying to think about in the estuary here is not some independent program. This is a set of ideas and tools that are being used across the nation and elsewhere across the world that we're trying to tap into in the Columbia River context. So I won't read all these to you, but beneficial use of dredge material, using dredge material for a productive purpose. Regional sediment management takes that idea and puts it in a systems context and tries to work across authorities and business lines, which if you work much with the Corps of Engineers, you know those are important to us. And finally, engineering with nature, trying to align the engineering processes, engineering tools with the natural processes to get greater sustainability and those environmental and economic and social benefits. So those are some terms you might hear me use. And here's a snapshot of where we stand right now in the estuary. And again, this is very simplistic. It's not meant to tell the entire story, but just provide a little context for these ideas I'll be sharing. First of all, the geomorphic processes that create and shape landforms have been diminished. Sediment transport, sediment supply has been changed. The hydrograph has changed. And the channel and floodplain themselves have been changed through navigation improvements, through diking and levees, through all manner of human activities. And second of all, as I mentioned earlier, the opportunities for hydrologic reconnection are limited. There certainly are more opportunities for floodplain restoration. There's some big projects in the pipeline, and the Corps and BPA are looking closely at future restoration opportunities. But at this point in our program implementation, we've been doing some form of restoration in the estuary. Gary could correct me, but somewhere on the order of 15 years or so, we've been working towards ecosystem restoration in the estuary. And we've had some successes. We've restored thousands of acres of habitat, but we've also run into some very challenging constraints, social constraints, infrastructure, there's just other uses for some of these lands that would also benefit, that we would like to benefit fish and wildlife. They're just not available for restoration. So that's partly what's causing us to think about what other opportunities could we have to restore habitat, and that leads us down the road of thinking about beneficial use. So here's a couple of key assumptions that go into these ideas. First of all, we take it as a given that dredging of the federal nav channel will continue. Maintaining that deep draft navigation channel is going to continue, and with that, there will be a continued availability of clean sand in large volumes. The second assumption is that processes that transformed dredge material in the past can do so in the future. Maybe at a diminished rate based on an altered hydrograph, but nonetheless, river velocities, river currents will move and reshape sand. The third is that we can find suitable sites to build projects, which at base are going to convert deeper water habitat to shallower water habitat. And the final assumption is that we can do this in a way where the benefits to the ecosystem outweigh the negative effects. Those are all assumptions. Some of them probably have more questions than others, but those are some key ones that we're thinking about. So with that in mind, this would be a sense of where we're trying to go in how we can better integrate these two programs, where we incorporate beneficial use within our routine dredging program, and we incorporate placement of dredge material as part of our overall ecosystem restoration program. It's not to say that we will be doing all of this. Let me back up. This area of overlap, that's obviously what we're targeting here. You'll see the words base plan. That refers to the routine program of dredging, essentially. And there will be times when what we would like to do with dredge material for habitat will cost more than that. And in those instances, the costs for those additional, I'm sorry about this. I haven't rehearsed this as much as I would like. Suffice it to say, we can get some significant cost savings for habitat restoration when we're aligning our ecosystem restoration work with the routine dredging of the navigation channel. Those costs would not be entirely borne by the navigation program, but nor would they be borne entirely by the ecosystem restoration program. So essentially, we're trying to leverage the two programs to get these shared benefits. We've been working over the last few months with a group of federal and state and tribal representatives to define some goals and principles for what this might look like. In short, what we're trying to do is maximize benefits while considering the costs and trade-offs, recognizing that sometimes there will be short-term impacts of placing dredge material, opportunity costs, that none of this, there's no free land in the estuary. Sometimes we talk about habitat creation. We're moving away from that terminology because there's already habitat there, so we're converting one habitat to another. So we're trying to be very cognizant of those trade-offs as we think about the potential benefits. And then you can see here some of the fundamental principles that we're trying to keep in mind. Multi-species restoration, process-based restoration, changing conditions in the estuary, collaborating with others, acknowledging the trade-offs, being aware of uncertainties, experimenting and learning as we go, and really trying to avoid long-term negative consequences. So with all of that in mind, all of that preparatory material, here's a couple of the ideas that we're thinking about of how we could actually operationalize using dredge material to get habitat benefits. So one approach would be to create or expand island features in places that are already hydraulically favorable. We've done this in the past. The top picture here shows Goat Island, where in combination with pile dikes, starting back in the 30s and continuing through the 50s or 60s, we placed large amounts of material, and it eventually evolved into some very high quality habitat. So in places like that, we could be expanding islands or building new islands. In other areas where we've got wide distances between the channel and the shoreline, we could build long, elongated spits to create embayments and sheltered areas to favor accretion and development of intertidal habitat. And that's what's shown in the lower picture, Miller Sands down in the lower estuary. A third concept is on shorelines, emulating scroll bars and swales, such as you see on the left picture there, Frenchman's Bar near Vancouver, essentially replicating the dynamics you would have seen when we had a higher freshet and an unimpaired sediment regime in the estuary, of the deposition, the swales that form on the inside of the bars, and connecting that habitat, not only for fish and wildlife, but not only for fish, but also herptiles and birds and other species. We could also, along the same lines, where we have extensive lengths of revetment, build out the shoreline and soften those revetments so that vegetation can establish and they provide more productive areas for fish to forage. And then finally, we could do what's called a strategic placement, where we place material in areas where we know it will be dispersed and form desired habitats, with some understanding of the risk of that material simply ending back up in the nav channel. We tolerate that to a certain extent already, given that we place so much of the material that we currently dredge back into the river. We know that some of it will end up back in the channel, but we would like to do that in ways where it has a higher likelihood of actually forming desired habitats. And what you can see on the right picture there is the tip of Turaski Island, and you see the large placement area. That's an upland placement site. But you can see downstream from there how that sediment has been winnowed and reshaped to form productive intertidal habitat. And so this strategic placement concept would not necessarily involve such large upland placements, but placing material in the water for it to be moved and then shaped into habitats such as that. And then finally, in each of these cases, we're not thinking simply of placing material and letting nature do good things, but complementing that with measures such as more complicated grading to get desired topography on a faster timeline, planting material. We've talked about adding fines from side channels, things of that nature. So in addition to the sort of conceptual model that I presented at the outset in terms of the altered sediment regime and the opportunity to look at different ways of restoring habitat, we're building on a foundation here of prior research products coming out of the Estuary program, where we've characterized reference sites. We've developed some understanding of relationships between vegetation and hydrology. We've worked in the past developing design guidelines for projects such as these, thinking about how to apply geomorphic concepts to the specific locations in the estuary to reflect the hydrology and geomorphology in the estuary. And then we're looking at what's happening elsewhere in the country, down in San Francisco Bay, where they're looking at accreting salt marshes through dredge material, or projects that have been done up in Puget Sound, restoring shorelines with dredge material. And this little histogram there on the right just shows the number of projects of specific types that have previously been done across the nation to get to these benefits. And what we're really trying to do is bring the Columbia River estuary into this arena and learn from others and share learnings from the estuary with others. But this is not really a new concept. It's just something that has not intentionally been done in the Columbia River estuary previously. Here's a few of the key uncertainties that we're trying to resolve, and we have work underway on each of these. We want to better understand how habitat develops on dredge material sites, so we know that we've created these types of habitats incidentally in the past, but we don't have a very granular understanding of exactly how that came to be. So Cindy is working with our Engineering Research and Development Center to answer these questions. We want to look at how placements such as these would impact the existing benthos, understanding that that's a valuable resource and an important trade-off we would be making. And finally, we want to validate the notion that doing things like this and restoring habitat through this approach would actually benefit juvenile salmon and steelhead and other wildlife species. Our next steps in addressing some of these questions are, first of all, completing some work we have underway currently, primarily the work Cindy's doing and the work we're doing with the other resource agencies thinking about site selection. We've got two projects lined up that we would like to implement and monitor. One is at Woodland Islands, just downstream from the mouth of the Lewis River, and this is a depiction of what that project would involve in terms of building out some lobes of material to accentuate habitat and expand habitat areas. At South Bachelor, WDFW is proposing to push material that was dredged a couple decades ago, so clean sand again, push that into the river as part of a larger tidal reconnection project and get some benefits from that shallow water placement. We then would want to use our evolving understanding to refine our conceptual model and begin thinking about more projects to refine these ideas. And then bigger picture, we're continuing to think with BPA and our other partners about how a beneficial use program could complement the overall strategy within the bigger CERP program. And that is the conclusion of my prepared talk. Thank you.
I think we have time for maybe one or two questions. Okay.
You just briefly mentioned wanting to find out if these changes have an impact on the fish and wildlife that you expect to use them. I'm just wondering how much of a monitoring program do you do, a pre and post sort of monitoring, or how much energy are you really expending in doing a monitoring and evaluation after the fact?
Sure, that's a very good question. I'll say at the outset that we're planning to do a much more robust monitoring program than we would typically do for an ecosystem restoration project. We're lucky in the estuary that we have the Columbia River Fish Mitigation Authority to do a higher level of research and monitoring and evaluation, so we're trying to tap into that authority. And Cindy is the lead on developing that study, but it is what we're looking at both Woodland Islands and South Bachelor is a before-after treatment and control. We would love to have multiple years of pre-treatment data, but that's unlikely. So it would be, at this point, given funding cycles and other factors, we'd probably have 1 year of baseline data from these sites, and then we would have multiple. We're thinking about extending the monitoring about 10 years into the future. And we'd be looking at a range of factors, but two really key aspects are the benthic organisms and fish use pre and post implementation.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And the concept that you pointed out, do more good than harm. I'm curious, is there any effort to monitor for organic and inorganic contaminants in the dredge material as you disperse it and pull it out? Certainly we've had some very good success without even being aware of that. So,
right. We, as part of the Corps' routine maintenance dredging, we, on a routine basis, look at the chemistry of the material to be dredged to make a determination as to whether it's suitable for placement in water. So we would be using that existing process of screening sediments and not specifically looking at it from a beneficial use perspective, but more from a fundamental dredge material management perspective. So the short answer is yes, but not as part of this program.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.